I knew something was off the moment Nolan wouldn't even look me in the eye. 16 years in that building, 16 years of 4 a.m. logins, 16 years of skipping Christmas mornings and anniversary dinners to fix his father's code, and now I was being handed a manila folder like a damn lunch receipt. Budget cuts, he muttered, flicking his wrist like I was lint. That was it. No handshake, no thanks, no I'm sorry. Just a silent HR rep hovering in the hallway like a funeral escort. I looked down at the paperwork, dry legal jargon dressed up to feel like mercy. It wasn't. It was a gut punch wrapped in a policy. Still, my hands didn't shake. I signed it. Slowly, quietly, like someone pulling the plug on life support with grace. Let's make sure this is done correctly, I told him. Not for his sake, hell no, but because I'd spent my whole career doing things the right way, even while everyone else cut corners. If you've listened this far, and this story's already got you pissed off or nodding because you've been there, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Seriously, 97% of people listen without subscribing, and it means the world to the team helping bring these stories to life. Thanks. Anyway, I didn't say goodbye, didn't pack a box. I walked straight out past the security desk, past the framed photos of the original team I helped build, past the wall I literally wired myself when the HVAC went out and nobody could afford to fix it. Every brick in that damn place still had my fingerprint on it. But to Nolan, I was just overhead, something to be trimmed. I got in my car, sat there, no music, no tears, just this weird clinical silence where my thoughts stopped trying to make sense of it. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was too stunned for that. You don't rage when your house burns down. You stand there watching the smoke curl into the sky, wondering how it all vanished so fast. What Nolan didn't realize was that he hadn't just fired a lead architect. He'd ripped out the very map his company was following without even knowing it, because the code base, the infrastructure, the system that held his father's empire together, that was mine. Not just conceptually, legally. Authorship rights, voting rights, and a little clause buried so deep in the original agreement that Nolan, with all his MBA swagger, never even knew to look for it. But I didn't gloat. Not yet. I went home, poured a strong coffee, sat on my back porch, and stared out at the trees. Birds didn't care I'd been fired. The wind didn't know my name. The sun still came up. That, weirdly, was comforting. You think when you lose a job like that, the world should tilt. It doesn't. It just keeps moving like nothing happened. That's the part that hurts most. The indifference of it all. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring once, twice, picked up, put it on speaker. Is this Darren Trask? I confirmed. This is Jenna Ford from Ordo Systems. We heard you're available. Our board is prepared to offer you a leadership role, double your last salary, full architectural control, and equity to match. I didn't say yes. I just leaned back, let the wind carry the silence, and asked, "When's the first planning meeting?" The first winter we moved into that shoebox office on Pike and Archer, the heat gave out 2 days before Christmas. Mitchell dragged in an old space heater from his garage. I brought in 2 thermoses of soup, and we just kept building. That's what people forget about legacy. It doesn't start with capital injections and press releases. It starts with frozen fingers hovering over keyboards, solving a routing issue at 3:12 a.m. while your breath thaws the glass. Back then, Mitchell didn't call himself CEO. Hell, we barely had desks. He was just Mitch, and I was just the woman who somehow always knew how to make the thing work. Whether that was the system kernel or the coffee machine's timer, there was no glory in it, no promotions. Just trust, and the kind of respect that doesn't need to be spoken. I wasn't just writing code, I was laying the arterial grid for an ecosystem no one else had the patience to understand. One night, while troubleshooting a cascading failure that brought down our entire dev environment, Mitchell slid a thumb drive across the table. "Just in case," he said. On it, a full outline of an internal royalty structure, a quietly authorized stock pool, and a clause so boring and legally dense that no one ever read it again. Except me, and the lawyer who set up D. Trask Systems LLC. I never flaunted it, never asked for a bigger office, declined the co-architect title twice. Titles were cheap, equity wasn't. Over time, my 16% sat in the shadows. It wasn't flashy, but it was contractually clean. That's the thing about smart systems. Real power lives beneath the interface. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to be seen. When Mitchell eventually stepped down, he didn't make a speech. He didn't send a memo. He just stopped coming in. Nolan filled the space like a puffed-up placeholder in expensive shoes and tighter suits, thinking governance lived in board decks and investor calls. He thought infrastructure was something you modernize with enough consultants and coffee bars. He never once asked about the original operating agreement, never noticed that the deployment pipeline's backbone ran through secure keys registered to D-Trask Systems LLC, never realized the architectural framework's metadata still listed me as primary author. He saw a name on the payroll. I saw a map no one else even knew existed. Nolan's mistake wasn't firing me. His mistake was thinking I hadn't already outgrown him a decade ago. But I stayed. Out of loyalty. Not to the company, but to the work. The systems, the logic, the people who depended on what we built to keep the lights on. Quite literally, in government data centers across 3 states. And here's the part that should have given him pause. I never asked for a raise. Never once negotiated compensation. Not because I wasn't paying attention, but because I already owned more than he ever would. He thought I was a line item. I was the root access. I didn't look back when the automatic doors slid shut behind me. Didn't need to. That place had already hollowed itself out the second Mitchell left, and Nolan started mistaking buzzwords for backbone. I walked to my car like I was leaving a dentist appointment. No heartbreak, no ceremony. Just a dull pulse where purpose used to live. In my right hand was the exit envelope. 2 pages, 1 final paycheck, 1 NDA that was laughably toothless. They still thought I was just another engineer with a loyalty problem. They had no idea the loyalty had died long before the ink dried. I drove home with the windows cracked, snow in the air, the same route I'd taken every weekday for 16 years, only this time it didn't lead to anything waiting for me. No meetings, no backlog, no notifications blinking for my approval, just silence. I hung my coat, kicked off my boots, poured a cup of stale coffee from yesterday's pot, and stared at the wall where I used to keep a whiteboard full of rollout schedules. It was blank now, like the rest of the day. Then the phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but some part of me, maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, pressed accept. I hit speaker. Is this Darren Trask? My voice cracked from disuse. Yes. This is Jenna Ford. I'm the Senior VP over at Ordo Systems. We heard about your exit. We'd like to bring you on immediately. Double your last salary, plus signing equity. Lead role, system autonomy, no babysitting. She didn't ask if I was interested. She knew. That's the thing. Real players don't pitch. They extend lifelines. I took a long sip. Let the pause linger. When's the first planning meeting? She laughed. Light, confident. Tomorrow morning, 10 sharp. We'll send a car. No need, I said, setting the mug down. I'll drive myself. What she didn't know was that I already had the Ordo's infrastructure in my head. I'd been watching them for years, quietly tracking their deployment models, noting where their bottlenecks would hit once scale passed critical mass. They were good, but they weren't ready for what was coming in Q2. And Nolan, with his manicured decks and secondhand strategy, sure as hell wasn't ready either. But I was. I'd been ready for years. By noon, I had 3 more voicemails, one from a CTO I'd mentored back in 15, one from a procurement manager who'd once told me I saved her marriage by getting their onboarding portal back up before a federal audit, and one from Mitchell. That one I didn't listen to, not yet. Instead, I pulled out the old notebook I kept for edge case scenarios. I flipped past pages of half-built architecture ideas, failover sketches, code fragments, and there it was. A 3-year-old draft titled, What Happens If Nolan Screws It All Up? I smiled, scribbled a new title on the top, What Happens Next? It didn't even take a full business cycle. By 10:24 a.m., screenshots were flying. My LinkedIn update had barely gone live. No hashtags, no bragging, just excited to join Ordo Systems as principal architect. And still, the ripple hit like a grenade in a fish tank. One of Nolan's mid-level devs dropped it in the internal Slack with a shrug emoji. Another followed it up with, does this mean we're screwed? The Slack threads spread like mold. Speculation, panic, silence. Then someone from compliance piped in with, who signed off on Darren's termination? A minute later, the message was deleted. But too late. The echo had already bounced. I wasn't watching, but people sent me things. Quiet allies, former interns. A senior analyst who once pulled me aside after a board meeting and said, you're the reason we have stability. They sent me snippets, Slack messages, calendar changes, requests for audit logs, frantic reschedules. By noon, the operations dashboard at Nolan's company showed a spike in internal queries, access logs, IP provenance, and worst of all, royalty clause refreshers. They were trying to backtrace what they'd kicked loose. But it wasn't internal panic that made it real. It was the clients. Government accounts don't like surprises, especially when those surprises involve personnel shifts tied to infrastructure blueprints that handle sensitive data flows. A longtime liaison at the Department of Energy forwarded a memo from Nolan's sales team trying to preemptively clarify that my departure would not impact continuity. The recipient had responded with a single line forward to Mitchell. Trask just joined Ordos. That's when Mitchell picked up the phone. The board was in the middle of their quarterly review when the front desk interrupted, said Mitchell was on line 1. Nolan had just wrapped up some toothless speech about modernization when the call patched through. He didn't even say hello, one of the analysts told me later. Just asked one question. Did my son just hand over our classified infrastructure designs to our only real competitor? The silence that followed was biblical. Mitchell wasn't a yeller. He didn't need to be. His disappointment was weaponized in its restraint. When he asked questions like that, they weren't rhetorical. They were warnings. Warnings wrapped in ice. Nolan tried to laugh it off. Dad, Darren was outdated. He hadn't updated the deployment stack since... Mitchell cut him off. I'm not asking about deployments. I'm asking about authorship. Who holds the licensing architecture? Someone coughed. A chair squeaked. No one had an answer. Because the answer wasn't in their systems. It was in mine, and it had just changed teams. What Nolan didn't understand was that tech isn't just code, it's trust. And when trust moves, contracts follow, clients follow, legacies follow, and sometimes so does destruction. The story made its way to me in pieces, fragments carried by people still loyal to the truth, not to titles. One of the senior engineers, the kind who always kept his head down and his dev environment cleaner than his apartment, sent me the first message. You should have seen Nolan's face, thought he was bulletproof. Turns out he brought a Nerf gun to a live fire exercise. Apparently, it started with a throwaway comment. Nolan's assistant mentioned in passing that I'd accepted a lead architect position at Ordos. He said it casually, maybe even smugly, like he thought it would get a rise out of his boss. But Nolan just scoffed. Didn't even look up from his phone. Let them have her, he said. She's replaceable. That was the moment Mitchell stepped through the glass door at the end of the corridor. They say he didn't speak right away, just stood there, white-knuckled and quiet, eyes locked on his son. The room, a financial strategy sync, stumbled into hush like someone had flipped a switch. One of the interns said it felt like watching a man realize in real time that he'd just cut the wrong wire on a bomb he didn't know was armed. Mitchell finally spoke, voice low, barely above a whisper, but the kind that vibrates through your ribs. You just fired the woman with authorship rights to every active system we license. There was a long pause. Nolan blinked, confused like a kid being told Santa Claus isn't just fake, he's also suing the family for breach of contract. Mitchell turned to the room, 6 executives, a junior analyst, 2 lawyers, and a consultant who was suddenly very interested in his shoes. Who owns the reference architecture? Mitchell asked. Nobody spoke, because nobody knew, because nobody read. That question wasn't for discussion. It was a detonator. A soft little click that echoed louder than any scream Nolan could have let loose. Because the second Mitchell asked it, the real implications began unfolding in their heads. If I held authorship rights, I held the IP chain. If I held the IP chain, their clients didn't just lose continuity. They lost legal grounds to use the software at all. And if Ordos now employed me, well, the licensing landscape had just shifted tectonically. I heard one of the board members tried to mumble something about contingency plans, but Mitchell cut him off. You all sat in this room and let my son terminate the person whose name is still embedded in every active federal contract. You think the Department of Defense is going to risk that kind of ambiguity just to save a few salaries? Another silence. Then Mitchell looked straight at Nolan. Do you even know what Section 3.4b is? Nolan stammered. It's just standard indemnity language, right? Wrong answer. That was the clause I'd buried years ago, the trigger, the fail-safe, the automatic notification protocol tied to any transfer of authorship or access control. It wasn't there to punish, it was there to protect. But now, in the hands of someone who'd been dismissed like scrap metal, it could gut their operational standing with a single digital signature. Mitchell didn't shout, didn't fire anyone. He just turned and left the room the same way he'd entered. Calm, deliberate, disgusted. That was the moment the house Nolan thought he inherited stopped being his. Not with an explosion, with a question. I waited until it got dark, not for drama, just for silence. The kind of quiet you need when you're about to do something permanent. The royalty clause wasn't a trap, it was a mirror. Section 3.4b existed to reflect what others failed to see. Authorship wasn't symbolic, it was legal, binding, measurable. It meant that if the company that deployed the system didn't retain its original architect or secure a proper transfer of rights, a protocol kicked in. A cascade of notices, legally required, non-negotiable, built for protection, not war, but now it was doing both. I opened my laptop, pulled up the old environment, my environment, and authenticated with a cold little line of code that hadn't been touched since Mitchell last reviewed the agreement. One keystroke, two-factor verification, then a soft green light. The system didn't ask me, "Are you sure?" It already knew. The clause triggered at 8:12 p.m. EST. Emails deployed to every contract-holding entity with an embedded dependency on my architecture. Government, defense, logistics, telecom, energy, 9 sectors in total. Each one received a formal notice. Change of architectural authorship. Review of continuity rights advised. Licensing validity pending. It wasn't an alarm bell. It was a surgical beep in a very quiet hospital room, followed by red lights on the compliance dashboard. The first response came less than 10 minutes later from a project manager at a state cybersecurity firm. Please confirm, does this impact our CERT compliance for Q1 deployment? I didn't reply. The system did. With full logs, timestamps, and source verification from D-Trask Systems LLC. By morning, 3 contracts had frozen deliverables. Within 72 hours, 6 more were on pause, pending clarification of architectural authority. No rage, no drama, just friction. The kind of friction that costs a company 10 grand per day per client just to maintain silence. I didn't gloat. I didn't even leave the house. While Nolan's office scrambled to explain why they no longer had legal continuity on infrastructure they'd licensed out over a decade, I was in sweatpants, drinking lukewarm coffee, adding annotations to a roadmap for Ordos' system overhaul. Jenna had sent over architecture files with full edit access and a note. "We trust your vision, build what they couldn't." The irony was, I wasn't trying to ruin Nolan. I was simply honoring a contract, the one he never read, the one Mitchell had signed with me in that freezing office on Pike and Archer, the one that didn't need lawyers or finger-pointing or vengeance, just one line of clean, compliant, unstoppable logic. And now, the systems he inherited, every line of code he misunderstood, were talking back, in my voice. They said Nolan looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, collar wrinkled, voice thin, eyes darting like a man scanning for a fire exit in a building he didn't know he'd set on fire. The federal liaison had been scheduled for a standard Q1 progress call. Nothing urgent, nothing scary, until the royalty clause notice hit her inbox 3 hours before. Suddenly, it wasn't a check-in, it was a compliance crisis. She logged into the call, saw Nolan, saw his CTO, heard the usual spiel about transitions in our architectural team and continuity of expertise across internal resources. Then she said 6 words that dropped like ice cubes into a boiling pot. "I'm not authorized to speak with you." Nolan blinked. "Excuse me?" "I've been instructed by counsel to only address the original licensed architect. Until that individual is reinstated or proper transfer is documented, this conversation is considered non-binding." He fumbled, tried to reroute the topic, said something about how the team was working with legacy documentation and streamlined DevOps integrations, but the CTO had already lowered his head. Everyone on the call could hear the clock ticking. The liaison disconnected without saying goodbye. That was the first time Nolan truly lost the room, because that's when everyone else realized he never owned it to begin with. His CTO, a decent guy I'd mentored back when he still used cheat sheets for Python, suggested what everyone in the room was thinking. "We could call Darren." Silence. Then Nolan's voice, clipped, sharp, unraveling. "No, she made her choice." Mitchell, listening in from the boardroom phone line, didn't say anything. Not then, not during the rest of the call. Just quietly muted himself and sent one message to the board secretary. "Emergency session. No Nolan." When the meeting took place, it was the first time in company history that the CEO wasn't invited. I wasn't there, but I was told the boardroom looked different that day. No presentation decks, no catered lunch, no idle small talk. Just Mitchell at the head of the table, flanked by the two remaining founders who still remembered what it was like to build something instead of just marketing it. He opened with a single question. Is this company run by titles or by knowledge? No one answered out loud. They didn't have to. By the end of the meeting, they'd motioned to freeze all deliverables tied to the disputed architecture. A vote passed to initiate third-party review of licensing risks. And Mitchell closed the session with the one sentence that cut through every ego in that building. If we can't bring her back, we'll have to buy our systems back from her. That wasn't a punishment, it was a correction, a realignment, a moment of clarity in an echo chamber full of executives who'd forgotten that infrastructure doesn't bend for bravado. It runs on who built it. And I had just been reminded, so did everything else. There was no triumphant return, no applause, no slow-motion hallway strut past the glass offices of the same people who used to cut me off mid-sentence in meetings. I didn't go back because there was nothing there worth returning to. Instead, I walked into Ordos' headquarters on a quiet Tuesday morning and met with leadership in a sunlit conference room that smelled like fresh paper and possibility. No ego, no empty flattery, just numbers, architecture blueprints, and one clean question from Jenna Ford. What do you need to build without compromise? It wasn't a pitch. It was a handshake before the contract. I outlined the terms. Matching equity, technical autonomy, no vanity hires, no brand consultants pretending to be engineers. I wanted control over architecture, not for power, but to protect the integrity of the system from the same kind of rot that killed my last company from the inside out. They agreed, not because they were desperate, but because they were smart. 2 weeks later, 5 members of my original team quietly gave notice at Nolan's firm. No drama, no trash talk, just resignation emails and NDA reminders. They were never mine to begin with, but we shared a way of building. And when I called, they didn't ask, why now? They asked, where do I log in? We hit the ground running. The Ordos rebuild wasn't a project. It was a redemption arc in code. I refactored every lazy shortcut Nolan's team had buried in the stack, restructured access control hierarchies, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to explain why a protocol had to be airtight. Meanwhile, Mitchell reached out again. His message was brief, direct. Not an apology, but close enough in tone to count. Can we talk about system access going forward? I didn't wait long to reply. I'm happy to license future systems at standard market rates. No smiley face, no softened language, just a firm line drawn in digital ink. He didn't argue. He didn't try to negotiate. He knew better. Respect isn't granted because someone gave you a desk 15 years ago. It's kept by how you treat the people who built the foundation beneath it. And now, the foundation had moved. I wasn't angry. I wasn't smug. I was simply done explaining my worth. They wanted systems. They could pay for them. They wanted stability. They could license it. They wanted the future. Well, I had already started building it. And for once, it would be on my terms. It was a Tuesday afternoon, mid-sprint, knee-deep in a system migration when I got the email. Subject line, thought you'd enjoy this. Attached was a link to Nolan's personal blog, something he'd resurrected now that the board had politely asked him to focus externally, while the grown-ups fixed what he'd broken. He'd been using it to posture as a thought leader, dropping buzzword bingo posts about disruption, transformative pivots, and the obligatory AI-integrated workflows that, ironically, still ran on the architecture I'd authored years ago. But this post was different. It was dressed up as a reflection piece, complete with a moody grayscale headshot and a headline that reeked of performative healing. Sometimes letting go of the old is how you embrace innovation. Cute. The post went on to describe how companies must shed legacy structures to make room for adaptive growth, and how stagnant leadership styles can't thrive in fast-moving markets. It was Nolan through and through, empty metaphors, dressed-up self-preservation, a whole lot of I decided where there should have been I panicked. It would have been forgettable. Except for the comment, one reply, short, plain text, no avatar, no signature flourish, Mitchell. Sometimes the old is what built everything you're standing on. That was it. No argument, No follow-up, just that sentence hanging in digital space, quiet as a tombstone. And it hit harder than any takedown thread or whistleblower leak ever could, because it came from the man who used to believe in him, the man who trusted him with an empire and watched him burn the scaffolding for a bonfire he couldn't control. I didn't screenshot it, didn't share it, just closed the tab and got back to work. The world didn't need me to dunk on Nolan. His systems were already doing that for me. Every time they stalled, every time a client asked why the architecture looked familiar, every time the board had to pay Ordos to fix what I had already built once, but better now. He could write all the blog posts he wanted, but the line between letting go and losing everything, he crossed it the day he fired me. He thought he was cutting overhead. He was severing the backbone.